Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. As we all know, the world has been globalizing in fields like politics, economics, trade, and other areas as well. The New York art world has been globalizing at the same time. The Guggenheim Museum has installed satellite installations in at least 3 other countries. And our very own Museum of Modern Art, known far and wide as MoMA, has been globalizing as well in its own fashion. It has been acquiring works by contemporary artists throughout the world. Here to tell us where MoMA is headed is its energetic director, Glenn Lowry. Glenn, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, let's start with demographics. Demographics are always interesting to people. How many visitors do you think MoMA saw last year?
We get about 3 million people a year through our door, and about another 25 million people a year that connect to us through social media and our various websites. So we look at ourselves as having an audience of about 30 million or more.
And how many would you say are from foreign countries?
Well, of the 3 million who come through our door, at least half are from abroad, and it's probably a very similar ratio with our social media followers. And then on the website, it skews a little more towards the United States than the rest of the world.
Now, we make some division between modern art and contemporary art. As we go on, the contemporary art becomes modern art, I suppose. But you just concluded I would say, a modern art exhibition of Matisse cutouts. And that was very successful, was it not?
It was one of our most successful exhibitions ever. I mean, Matisse is one of those iconic, heroic figures, and this last decade of his life that was the focus of the cutouts was a joyous, remarkable decade in which he created a new kind of art form, and I think people caught on to that, enjoyed it, and it was one of those exhibitions that reached way beyond a traditional audience.
The Guggenheim, as we said at the top of the program, has established satellite installations in other countries. Does MoMA propose to do that as well, bricks and mortar in Abu Dhabi?
We're not going to have bricks and mortar elsewhere in the world, but we do have partnerships with sister institutions around the world, whether they're in Europe, like the Centre Pompidou or the Tate, where we work extensively together, or projects like we've done in Perth, Australia, where we've had multi-year relationships to do exhibitions and programming. So we're looking to build a network of relationships around the world. But beyond that, we're always traveling exhibitions from abroad, working with colleagues and artists from abroad, and most importantly, collecting from around the world.
Do you emphasize collecting from outside the United States and also exhibiting artists, contemporary artists, from outside the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, today's art world, whether you're talking about the modern world or the contemporary world, and they're really the same, one is kind of the leading edge of the other, is a totally globalized world. It's impossible to think about contemporary artistic practices today without thinking about what's going on in Latin America, what's happening in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere in the world. So the challenge for us is, how do we develop the knowledge and the expertise to act intelligently and inquire well as we look around the world? And to do that means thinking carefully, building networks of relationships with artists, critics, scholars, and creating a kind of infrastructure, an intellectual infrastructure that allows us to dive deeply and make intelligent choices. But if you look at our collection today, especially what we're collecting today, it is far more international than it's ever been.
Now, at what point did you embark upon this program of global acquisition?
Well, like everything at the Museum of Modern Art, nothing's new under the sun. When Alfred Barr created the museum at the end of the 1920s and started to build the collection, he recognized that modern art, as he understood it then, was not something confined to Europe and North America. In fact, the second great exhibition we did, I think it was in 1931 or 1932, was of Diego Rivera, a Latin American artist. So he understood from the outset that we were going to have an international perspective. But over the decades, the collection more or less aligned itself along a European and North American axis. Although if you look carefully at what was acquired, we were acquiring works of art from Iran in the 1960s, from Asia in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, from Latin America from the 50s on. So we've always had a diverse perspective. It's simply that today, that perspective is even more intense and even more robust. And certainly the last decade has seen an incredible focus on what's going on, first in Latin America, secondly in Asia, and then third elsewhere in the world.
Everything that's old is new again.
Something like that.
Something like that. Would you say in today's art world there's such a thing as modern art or contemporary art or Asian art or South American art? I mean, how would you categorize what's going on now?
It's a great question, because part of the challenge is when we talk about a contemporary art practice or contemporary artistic practices, what we tend to do is think about practices that are like. So like practices in China, like practices in India, like practices in Latin America. But there are also very strong regional voices that don't fit into that broader overview or umbrella that we sometimes think about when we talk about contemporary art, as if it were a singular phenomena. The challenge is particularly acute in places like the Middle East that have long-standing traditions that go back centuries, and how do those traditions engage with the present in new and interesting ways? And so what we've tried to do is to think about those practices today that either articulate new voices, new ways of thinking, or connect historically to the past in an interesting way. We have an exhibition that just opened at MoMA PS1 on Wael Shawky, a young Egyptian artist who works with puppets, marionettes, sometimes even European puppets from the late 18th, 19th century, to retell stories about the Crusades, not from the perspective of the Crusaders, but from the perspective of the Arabs whose countries were invaded. And while the idea of working with puppets isn't new, the idea of using puppets to tell a different kind of story is fascinating. So that's an example of how one can reimagine a new kind of practice, even though it's using a traditional or historical subject.
I think it's kind of common ground that in the time of Matisse, the art center of the world was Paris. And then you move on, it became New York, perhaps, in the time of Rothko and Still and others. And where is the center of gravity today? Where is the action in the art world? What city and what country?
Well, to a large extent, I think it's around the world. I mean, the Second World War fractured that notion of a homogeneous European center of the art world. And so Paris, which had in fact been the primary place in Europe, certainly from the teens to the 40s, suffered like everywhere in Europe after the Second World War. And that meant that places like New York that were able to survive the war without the kind of damage that took place in Europe could become robust places. But today, you have to look at Sao Paulo and Rio, you have to look at Shanghai and Beijing, you have to look at Perth and Sydney and Melbourne, and so on and so forth. And I think what's fascinating is that we have a decentered art world. It isn't that New York is no longer important. I think many people would still argue New York is the primary place. But it's not the only place. And if you want to be engaged, if you want to be in the kind of center of where the art world is, it means you have to be everywhere. The Sharjah Biennial, which opens this week in the Middle East, is one of the great biennials today. It didn't exist 20 years ago. So we're seeing a rapid transformation of how the contemporary art world actually looks.
Now, you mentioned your digital program. Can you briefly tell us what that looks like? Social media and so forth?
We set out probably well over a decade ago to build as robust a digital platform as we possibly could. This wasn't rocket science. Every major museum was looking at how to take their website and expand it, enhance it, enrich it. And today what we realize is that the website is just one vehicle by which we can connect to the world. That social media, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or whatever, offers a whole new platform. And so we now have something like 4 million followers on our social media platforms, which I think is the largest of any museum, certainly any art museum in the world. And what that means is it creates a kind of glue that connects us to an audience that may never visit the museum. And what we're thinking about is the 24/7 audience, the notion that we can create conversations through digital platforms that connect people either on-site or off-site to each other and to the institution whenever they want to connect. And that's an extraordinary opportunity to build knowledge, to build relationships, and also to learn from those people who might never visit the museum, but who might have really interesting ideas about what we're talking about.
So what you're doing is interactive.
Totally. I mean, I think the big change that's occurred in museums, let's say in the last 5 to 10 years, is the recognition that they're participatory spaces. It used to be the idea that the museum was a bit of a box in which you came to see a work of art, and that was a relatively passive exercise. The object existed in space, hung on the wall, stood in the middle of a room, and you looked at it and moved on. Today we know that there's a much greater desire to participate, not just in connecting to the art through the institution, through friends that you might be with, through the conversations we can create, but even participating in making art. And so those artists who create participatory experiences find new ways of connecting to people. And what we're trying to do is harness their energy and their ideas into creating conversations that will bind people to the kinds of ideas that we're interested in at the museum.
Well, let's pivot to Asia, the way the United States government says it's doing. You acquired works of Asian artists. You've mentioned it. One is Fang Mangbo, who produced a work called The Long March, which is more like a video game. Tell us about that and why that's part of your strategy.
Fang Mangbo is a relatively young Chinese artist, and Kathy Hallbreich, our associate director, and Klaus Biesenbach, the director of MoMA PS1, and I saw his work about 6 or 7 years ago at the Guangzhou Biennial, and we were blown away by it because what he did was to take the legendary Long March of Mao and turn it into a video game. So first of all, it is an interactive, participatory work. People who come into the space of this work of art get a controller and can actually play the game, and it has many different levels. I've never succeeded past the first level, but I'm sure there are going to be game wizards who can take it all the way to the end. And he turns the Long March into a kind of interactive play that allows you to see the way in which Mao moved across the country, ultimately arriving in Beijing.
Do you think that works such as this will find favor with a new, younger generation of visitors to the museum and visitors, indeed, to your website?
I'm sure. I mean, first of all, for my generation, learning how to play a video game requires a lot of time and energy. For younger audiences, it's automatic. They get exactly what to do. They know all the moves instinctively. They don't need to be taught the rules and the lessons. But much more importantly, I think it relates to the kinds of visual experiences lots of younger people have every day.
Let's stay with China for a moment. You also have a work of Kai Guo Chung, which is a boat with arrows. Now, is that do you consider that to be political art?
Well, it's certainly a political work. I mean, Kai Guo Chung is one of the great Chinese artists who moved to the United States from China well over a decade ago, who has a really robust practice and has been at the vanguard of contemporary practices in China and in the United States. This is a work, My Enemy's Arrows, that relates to an old Chinese story about a general who in a fight ran out of ammunition, and he was stranded and didn't know what to do. So he found an old boat, and he put these straw effigies in the boat, and he attached a rope to the vessel, and he floated it out into the river. His enemies started to fire on it, thinking that they were being invaded. After they had exhausted all of their arrows, he pulled the boat back with the rope, took the arrows out of the straw, rearmed himself, and was able to go on and have victory. And I think it's one of those works that tells the story of perseverance, ingenuity, and of course the politics of warfare. It's one of those great works of art that we could only have had because Patty Cisneros, one of our legendary trustees, saw it, loved it, and made it a gift for the museum.
Now, let's just move across the China Sea, if we can, to Japan. You have works of Murakami, who was kind of a cartoonist, isn't he?
Well, Takashi Murakami is a great contemporary artist who uses the language often of Japanese prints, sometimes of Japanese comics, manga, to animate his works. And we have this extraordinarily beautiful screen that takes these comic-like figures, but he treats them very much as if it were a beautiful 18th or 19th century gold background silk screened painting, or screen painting. And what it does is it takes a traditional idea of the screen, multi-part panel screen, animates it with the energy of a contemporary voice, and produces something that is scaled at a much greater size than you would have had in a traditional screen, and it makes it very exciting.
So it's in the Japanese tradition of anime and manga, the cartoons that people enjoy in Japan and around the world.
Well, it takes that language, but it also fuses it with a more historical language of the Japanese screen painting. And that's part of its cleverness, is to take something that's absolutely new and fuse it with something that's historical and old and rescale it to a completely different size.
Turning to Korea, which at times calls itself the shrimp between two whales, the two whales being China and Japan, you have the work of Haeg Yang, and very interesting work called Salim. Now, she's a Korean woman who lives in Berlin.
She is indeed. Haegu Yang is one of those young artists from Korea who've built really robust careers. And Salim takes a look at her kitchen in Berlin, decomposes it, and restructures it. And what she does when she creates these installations is to imagine absences, the things that are not there, which gives emphasis to the things that do appear. And they always have this kind of almost anarchic quality to them, with objects that look like they're flying off in space. But there is much about the void of what isn't in a space that you imagine should be, as much as they are about what's physically there.
But everything seems to be there, including the kitchen fan.
And the kitchen sink.
And the kitchen sink, that's right. Well, she puts everything into it. Let's look at Latin America for a moment. You have the works of, or a work by Rikrit Tiravanija, who's a Thai, born in Argentina. So it's half Asian, half Latin American.
Well, in a way, Rikrit is the ultimate global artist. It's not just that he comes from a background that brings together two different parts of the world, but he lives as comfortably in the United States as he does in Europe, as he does in Asia. He was a pioneer of what's called relational aesthetics. It is the idea of collaborating with other artists to create participatory experiences for an audience. He made his mark in New York years ago with a kitchen that he built that was essentially part of his apartment, where he invited people to come in and he cooked curry for them. We ultimately bought a version of that kitchen for the museum. And the notion was that one could be very generous as an artist. It was an invitation to other artists to collaborate with him, but much more importantly to his friends and to the public to share something that he prized, a good meal of green curry.
Well, moving from meal to the title of his work, which is part of the work itself, The Days of the Society Are Numbered. Is this a political message?
Well, for sure, it's a political message. I mean, there's no way to avoid that, and I think it's why we like that work so much. It's part of an exhibition that we recently opened called Scenes from a New Heritage, which looks at those works of art and artistic practices that don't find a place every day in most of our museums, and certainly haven't found a place on a daily basis at the Museum of Modern Art, even though we've been collecting in this area extensively. And Scenes from a New Heritage opens that conversation up to these different artistic practices that are as important as any other practices. And I think Rikrit's work declares that we have to rethink where we are, that society is changing, and that is definitely a political comment. Just look at the demographics of the United States alone, and you know that the traditional structures of this country are giving way to new structures, and we as an institution have to be sensitive to that and responsive to it.
Coming back to the Western Hemisphere with Chile, you have the work of Arturo Jara. Tell us about that. Why is that in your collection?
Well, Alfredo is definitely a political artist. He's deeply interested in social issues, but he's also interested in the way in which images function. And this work really examines both the production of images, how they are made, how they are circulated, and often what they don't tell us. And Alfredo's really concerned about the fact that we often witness enormous violence and evil, and frequently we'll photograph it, document it, but we won't act on it. And in a way, his work is a call to action, that we have to be responsible for what we see and what we do, and it's not good enough just simply to know that bad things happen, that he wants us to be motivated to respond to that.
Now, your interest in Latin America is not confined to paintings and installations because you're about to do a major architectural exhibition of Latin American architecture. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. We've been fascinated by Latin American architecture at the museum really since the late 1930s and early 1940s. Barry Bergdahl, a brilliant curator at the museum, has been working on this project for 4 or 5 years now, and it's an attempt to look at what's been going on in Latin America since the 1950s, really up through the 1980s, from Uruguay all the way up to Mexico and just about every place in between. Barry's a historian, and of course what he wants to do is set the contemporary practices of Latin America in the context not only of what was happening elsewhere in the world, but most specifically within an internal conversation in Latin America. And of course what took place in Colombia is obviously different than what occurred in Argentina or Chile or Uruguay or Mexico. But the point is that there have been really, since the advent of modernism in Latin America, powerful original voices that are really worth looking at. In the past, we've tended to see these voices as they relate to European and North American practices. And the point of this exhibition is to look at them within their own development and region, not dependent on what was taking place elsewhere in the world.
Let's talk about the current exhibition of the pop singer Bjrk, which has excited a great deal of comment and controversy and is just beginning to get off the ground at the museum right now. It's attracted hundreds and hundreds of people to previews and excited a tremendous amount of critical comment, pro and con. Tell us, what attracted you to Bjrk, who's an Icelandic singer, an iconic figure of the 1990s and on, to show a retrospective of her work in the museum?
Well, Bjrk is one of those artists, not unlike Rickrit, that comes out of this relational environment that loves to collaborate with other artists, whether they are fashion designers or filmmakers or people who work in the digital world. We actually acquired Bjrk's app, Biophilia, a year ago because it's such an interesting way of fusing science, technology, and music. And sound has become an art form unto itself that we're interested in and that we collected. So Bjrk struck us as one of those artists who had a kind of multivalent practice. And clearly the basis of it was her music videos that are ravishingly beautiful, often incredibly complicated, and frequently produced with some of the most interesting producers and directors in the world.
You also show her costumes.
And we thought it would be interesting to not only explore her video work, but also some of these iconic costumes that
like bell dress.
Like the bell dress designed by Alexander McQueen. So she's been working with really fascinating people. So we wanted to explore the relationship between her collaborators, and her own music. And like any project that breaks new ground and that asks us to think differently about practice as an artist, it's going to be very controversial. There are people who have absolutely hated the exhibition, felt that it didn't live up to their expectations, and there are others who find it ravishingly beautiful and engaging. And this is the kind of show that's going to hover between these two very different poles.
Well, to exhibit the work of Bjrk, you kind of created a museum within a museum, a mini space, and the visitor walks through the space and listens to the music of Bjrk and listens to other things about her life and what she did and her revolution as an artist. Is this unique in museums? Has anything like this been done before?
There have been other exhibitions of musicians. There has been a touring exhibition of David Bowie's work that I think started at the V&A and has traveled around North America and elsewhere. That
V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum in London.
Absolutely, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And it's a great show that really explored his practices as a musician, but also as a collaborator and somebody who's an incredibly original voice. And we did at the Museum of Modern Art an exhibition of Kraftwerk, electronic musicians from Germany, a couple of years ago that was a retrospective of all of their albums. And they performed during that retrospective, which was fantastic. So there's a growing interest in working with musicians in museums, especially those musicians who are so fascinated by visual culture as Kraftwerk or Bjrk or David Bowie are.
I have a question for you, Glenn Lowry. Why is MoMA going global?
MoMA is going global because the world is global. We have no alternative, and besides that, it's interesting, fascinating, and important.
Interesting, fascinating, and important. Thank you so much for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. Don't forget to visit Bjrk at MoMA, who'll be there until June 7th. You're in for really an extraordinary experience. For Conversations in the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. All the best.